What does a country do when the most powerful military on Earth spends 13 straight nights telling it exactly where the next blow is landing, and it still refuses to move? That question sits at the center of everything you're about to hear, because the answer just arrived, and it did not arrive quietly. Before we go further, hit that like button, because this is the kind of story that shapes what you pay at the pump next month, not just what happens on a map thousands of miles away. Subscribe if you want to follow this war as it unfolds in real time, not weeks later, once everyone else has already caught up. And if you know someone who thinks oil prices just move on their own, send them this video, because they're about to learn exactly where those numbers come from. Some islands are protected by walls, some are protected by soldiers lined along the coast. Kharg Island was never protected by either. For decades, it was protected by something far more effective. The simple fact that hitting it directly was considered too costly for anyone to seriously attempt. That protection just ended. Let's start with the geography, because none of this makes sense until you understand what this island actually is. Kharg sits in the northern Persian Gulf, a small strip of land roughly 25 miles off Iran's southwestern coast. It isn't a fortress. It isn't lined with troops the way you'd picture a hardened military position. At its core, it's a loading terminal, a set of deep-water jetties and pipelines built to move Iranian crude out of the ground and into the hulls of the largest tankers on the planet. And here's the number that explains why this one island matters more than almost any other patch of ground in this entire conflict. Roughly 90% of Iran's crude exports move through Kharg before they ever reach a buyer anywhere in the world. Not some of it, not most of it. 9 out of every 10 barrels Iran sells abroad pass through this single location first. Think about what that means for a government trying to fund a war. Nearly the entire financial lifeline that keeps Iran's state running, its military supplied, and its currency from collapsing under sanctions, funnels through pipelines, feeding loading arms on one narrow stretch of coral and sand. There's no equivalent backup sitting somewhere else that could absorb what Kharg processes in a single week. Smaller terminals exist at Bandar-e Mashar on the mainland, on Lavan Island, on Siri Island, but none of them individually, and not even all of them combined, can replace what Kharg alone is built to move. That's why, for years, striking Kharg directly was treated by American planners as a line nobody wanted to cross. Not because it was militarily hard. Precision weapons can hit almost anything with enough planning, but because of what happens after the missiles land. You don't just dent a budget for a season when you hit a terminal like this. You threaten to alter what a country can sell, to whom, and for how much, for years afterward. That kind of damage doesn't stay contained to one government's ledger. It ripples straight into global oil markets, and global oil markets touch everyone who's ever looked at a price sign at a gas station. That's the weight this island has always carried. For months, even as this war ground on, even as strikes hit military sites, missile depots, radar installations, and drone launch positions across Iran, Kharg's oil infrastructure itself stayed largely untouched. Back in the spring, when American aircraft did strike the island, the targeting stayed deliberately narrow. Storage facilities, sites tied to naval mines, systems used to threaten the Strait of Hormuz. The export terminal itself was left standing. That wasn't an accident. It was policy. Now let's talk about the 13 nights that came after that policy started to crack. Because what makes this moment different isn't only what eventually happened, it's what was said publicly and repeatedly in the weeks leading up to it, and what Iran's leadership chose to do with every single one of those warnings. Through the early summer, tension along the Strait of Hormuz kept climbing. Iran had agreed, on paper, to stop threatening commercial shipping through the strait. Ships started moving again. Then attacks on tankers resumed, and a fragile understanding that had briefly calmed the region collapsed in the span of a week. The American president stood at a NATO summit and declared the ceasefire over. Strikes resumed, and this time the warnings that followed carried a name that hadn't been spoken so directly before: Kharg Island. Night after night, through public statements and military signaling, through the kind of language governments use when they want an adversary to understand exactly what's coming without tipping the timing of the strike itself, Washington made its intentions unmistakable. Hit Iran hard. Take aim at the energy base. Strike the civilian-facing infrastructure that keeps this war funded. Each warning added weight to the last. Each one gave Tehran another chance to disperse assets, to prepare for what increasingly looked less like a bluff and more like a countdown. For 13 consecutive nights, Iran did not move. Sit with that for a second, because it explains almost everything that follows. When a government is warned about a specific named target more than a dozen separate times, and still doesn't relocate the assets sitting inside it, there are really only two explanations that make any sense. The first is that Iran's leadership genuinely believed the warnings were theater, a pressure tactic meant to extract concessions at the table rather than a real military plan waiting to execute. Governments bluff constantly in situations like this, and if you've survived enough rounds of escalating threats without a follow-through, it becomes tempting to assume the next round plays out the same way. The second explanation is far more unsettling. and it says something deeper about the position Iran actually found itself in. It's possible Tehran looked at these warnings, understood them as credible, and still concluded that moving the asset created a more serious danger than simply absorbing the strike. Maybe there was nowhere safer to send that kind of infrastructure. Maybe any visible attempt to disperse operations would have signaled weakness at the exact moment weakness invites more pressure. Maybe the calculation was never about whether the strike was coming, but about which version of the coming damage was survivable. A country that stays still after 13 direct warnings isn't a country that failed to understand the threat. It's a country that ran the numbers in rooms we will never see and concluded its remaining options were narrower than anyone watching from outside realized. And then, last night, the warning stopped and the strike landed. If you're starting to feel the weight of that, good, because we're only getting started. What comes next determines whether this becomes the moment that ends this war, or the moment that makes it far more dangerous for everyone connected to it, including people who have never once thought about a small island in the Persian Gulf. Let's talk about exactly what was hit, because the precision here matters enormously for understanding what recovery actually looks like. This strike didn't touch Kharg's residential areas. It didn't hit the surrounding shipping lanes used for general marine traffic. What it hit was the operational core, the loading and pumping infrastructure on the island's primary export complex, the specific systems that move crude out of underground pipelines and into the hulls of waiting tankers. That distinction changes everything about what comes next. A strike on military hardware can often be patched through military logistics, spare parts moved through existing supply chains, replacement equipment sourced from allies willing to look the other way on sanctions. A strike on specialized export infrastructure is an entirely different category of problem. It requires precision engineering. It requires components originally designed and certified by companies that, under current sanctions law, are legally barred from supplying Iran with anything at all. Iran has weathered infrastructure damage before. After earlier conflicts, after years of sanctions forced it to run aging systems without Western parts or expertise, the country built real domestic engineering capability specifically because it assumed outside help would never come again. That self-sufficiency is genuine and shouldn't be dismissed. But there's a meaningful gap between keeping worn equipment limping along through careful maintenance and rebuilding infrastructure that has just been deliberately, precisely targeted. The repair timeline here isn't measured in days, and realistically not even in weeks. It depends entirely on whether Iran can source what it needs through partners willing to move critical components through supply channels already under heavy strain from the length of this war. There's a principle worth holding on to, because it stretches far beyond this one island. You can destroy in half an hour something that took 30 years to design, build, and calibrate. You cannot rebuild that same capacity in 30 months if the certified replacement parts remain sanctioned and the engineers who understand the system best are legally forbidden from going anywhere near it. That asymmetry, destruction moving faster than reconstruction ever can, is the real story sitting under the smoke over the Persian Gulf right now. So why did Washington choose this specific moment and this specific target? The logic behind it reveals something bigger than one strike. For most of this conflict, American strategy operated inside a fairly consistent boundary. Hit the Revolutionary Guard, hit missile sites, radar installations, drone launch positions, but stay away from infrastructure with direct global commodity market consequences, because once that boundary is crossed, the economic and diplomatic fallout becomes extremely difficult to contain. That boundary held for months through repeated public threats that never quite turned into action. It no longer holds. What this strike demonstrates isn't a tactical decision about one target on one night. It's a threshold decision, the kind of choice that signals a fundamental recalculation about what costs are acceptable in pursuit of a strategic outcome. And every government watching this conflict, whether or not they have troops anywhere near the Gulf, is now processing what that threshold shift means for their own planning. Gulf monarchies, watching their own energy infrastructure. Beijing, which depends heavily on discounted Iranian crude. Moscow, which has spent years building its own workaround logistics for sanctioned oil. Every one of them just watched the rules of what counts as an acceptable target shift in real time. That's not a regional signal, it's a global one. Let's talk numbers, because the economic weight behind this strike needs to be understood before the political analysis makes real sense. Iran's oil revenue throughout this war has never flowed in the open. It moves through intermediaries, sold at steep discounts, routed through channels built specifically to stay invisible to Western financial monitoring. But even under those constrained conditions, Kharg was still moving oil every single day. Not at the volumes Iran exported before sanctions truly tightened, not at the prices it once commanded, but enough, consistently enough, to keep the government's operating budget from collapsing outright. Enough to help fund the military campaigns, the proxy networks, and the weapons programs that have defined this war from day one. The real question now isn't whether Iran lost something strategically significant. It clearly did. The harder question is exactly what fraction of Iran's current operating revenue was moving through this terminal at the moment the strike landed, and even analysts with access to the best satellite imagery and financial tracking available are genuinely uncertain about that number right now. What isn't uncertain is who's watching closest. China has remained Iran's most consistent buyer of discounted crude throughout this war, and Chinese officials are reportedly monitoring Kharg's operational status closely this week. India's refineries, which have maintained limited unadvertised purchase arrangements, are running the same calculations behind closed doors. The oil itself hasn't disappeared from the ground. What's been damaged is the mechanism for getting that oil out of the ground, onto a tanker, and into the global market. That kind of uncertainty is what commodity markets fear more than almost anything else, because uncertainty can't be hedged with any real confidence. You can plan around a known shortage. It's much harder to plan around a shortage with no confirmed end date. Kharg's loading infrastructure was originally engineered to foreign specifications, foreign equipment standards, foreign supply chains, built up over decades before sanctions cut Iran off from most of that access. The companies that originally designed and built this equipment are legally barred from supplying Iran with certified replacement parts of any kind. Iran's domestic engineering capability has genuinely grown over the past decade, built around the assumption that outside help would remain unavailable indefinitely. But there's a real measurable gap between keeping aging infrastructure running through maintenance and rebuilding infrastructure that was just deliberately targeted for maximum disruption. That gap is measured in months at minimum, and that estimate assumes Iran can even source what it needs through relationships already under strain from how long this war has run. This is where the story stops living only in the Persian Gulf and starts showing up in the daily lives of people who have never heard of Kharg Island and likely never will. When a terminal responsible for a meaningful share of global oil supply sustains damage with no confirmed repair timeline, markets don't wait for an official assessment before reacting. They price in the uncertainty almost immediately, because uncertainty itself carries a cost. The inability to plan ahead, the inability to tell the next buyer down the chain what supply will look like 90 days out. We've watched this mechanism play out before, prices spiking within hours of satellite images being confirmed, long before any ground-level damage assessment reached the public. Kharg is structurally different from a shipping lane a tanker can simply reroute around given enough notice. It isn't a processing facility with a convenient backup sitting idle somewhere. It is, quite literally, the primary mechanism through which the overwhelming majority of Iran's crude enters the global supply system, and there is no equivalent backup waiting in reserve. That chain reaches further than most people ever realize. Gasoline prices connect to it, heating bills connect to it, shipping costs, import prices, the price tags on ordinary goods on shelves thousands of miles from this conflict, all of it links back through a long, often invisible pricing chain to this narrow stretch of water and the island sitting inside it. For someone living on a fixed income, someone who feels every fuel price shift before any official report acknowledges it, this isn't a distant headline about a foreign war. It's next week's number at the pump. It's October's heating bill. It's a quiet cost nobody in government is going to stand up and take responsibility for, even though it traces directly back to decisions made in rooms far from any gas station. Now let's turn to the part of this story that determines where everything goes from here. Because Kharg being struck doesn't end this conflict, it forces Iran into a decision, and that decision will shape the next chapter of this war more than almost anything that's happened so far. Iran has 4 realistic paths available in the immediate aftermath of a strike like this one. The first is the option Tehran has threatened publicly for months, a total closure of the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping. Not selective harassment of specific vessels, not new transit fees on particular carriers, a complete shutdown of marine traffic through the single most important energy choke point on the planet. This option carries dramatic weight, and it's also the most complicated for Iran to actually follow through on, because closing Hormuz doesn't only hurt Iran's adversaries, it destroys Iran's own remaining export routes, including the alternative pathways any real economic recovery would eventually depend on. It converts every government in the Gulf, including governments that have stayed quietly sympathetic to Iran throughout this war, into direct victims of a decision made entirely by Tehran. Roughly a fifth of the world's seaborne oil moves through that strait on an ordinary day. Closing it doesn't just escalate a regional conflict. It converts Iran's global image almost overnight from a country under attack into a country actively causing a worldwide economic crisis. Iran's second realistic option is a smaller, targeted asymmetric response, striking something of comparable economic weight without triggering the total catastrophe a full closure would guarantee. We've already seen smaller strikes on regional energy infrastructure move oil markets measurably within hours during this war. A direct Iranian response against Saudi or Emirati infrastructure, or against a specific commercial shipping target somewhere in the Gulf, would be smaller in scale than closing Hormuz entirely, but it would keep this conflict escalating on Iran's own timeline rather than reacting purely to Washington's, and controlling that timeline, even partially, carries real strategic value on its own. The third option is what analysts have started calling the pivot and price strategy. Iran shifts its remaining operational export capacity toward its secondary terminals, the mainland facility at Bandar-e, the smaller loading points at Lavan and Siri. None of these individually, or even combined, can fully replace what Kharg alone was capable of moving, but together they represent a meaningful fraction of that volume, enough to maintain some level of revenue while the primary terminal undergoes whatever repair remains realistically achievable. Russia, which has spent years building its own parallel infrastructure for exporting sanctioned oil, becomes an even more direct operational partner under this scenario. The oil keeps moving, just at lower volume, lower price, through longer and more expensive routes. But it moves, and the regime preserves the image of a government that absorbed a serious blow and kept functioning anyway. The fourth option generates the least immediate noise and may carry the most significant long-term consequences of all four, which is exactly why it deserves the most careful attention. Iran deepens its role as a supplier of weapons and support to its network of regional proxies. Operations that depend on Iranian weapons, intelligence coordination, and logistical support continue at their current intensity. Pressure, sustained by supply chains that remain at least partially functional even after a strike of this magnitude continues along multiple regional fronts. Under this model, Iran essentially converts its oil revenue problem into a leverage problem instead. The underlying message to anyone considering further escalation becomes brutally simple. You cannot fully shut down what I'm capable of doing without confronting every network I currently supply, and confronting all of those networks costs far more than whatever you gain by striking one island. This isn't a new strategy for Iran, it's one it has leaned on for decades. But a strike that removes a significant share of Iran's cash income doesn't necessarily make this proxy leverage approach less attractive to the regime. In many ways, it makes it more attractive, because it shifts Iran's remaining leverage away from economic assets it no longer fully controls, toward military coercion assets it still controls completely. That's the counterintuitive risk, sitting quietly underneath this entire situation, one planners in Washington need to work through with real care. Weakening a government, economically, doesn't automatically reduce its willingness to use force elsewhere. In some cases, it does the opposite. Let's zoom out, because looking at this single strike in isolation risks making it seem more conclusive than the reality actually is. This is, without question, the most economically significant single military action this conflict has produced so far. No earlier strike targeted infrastructure responsible for this large a share of a major oil exporter's total revenue in one operation. But it is not, by itself, a knockout blow that strips Iran of its ability to act, to threaten, or to sustain the networks it has spent 4 decades building. Iran's government survived earlier sanctions that effectively cut it off from the global banking system entirely. It has survived years of sustained military pressure throughout this conflict. This strike adds a genuinely new category of economic consequence to that ledger, but the real question isn't whether Kharg represents a serious setback. It clearly does. The real question is whether this specific blow pushes Iran's leadership toward a negotiating position it had previously refused to seriously consider, or whether it strips away enough of what Iran had left to lose that its leadership now calculates there's simply less reason left to hold anything back. Those two outcomes can look nearly identical from the outside for the first several days. They tend to look very different 6 weeks later, once the initial shock wears off and the actual decisions start showing up in how each side behaves. Somewhere tonight, in planning rooms that model exactly this kind of economic trajectory, analysts are running precisely this calculation, trying to figure out whether they're watching a government being pressured toward the table or a government being cornered into a position where escalation becomes the only path that preserves its own legitimacy at home. History doesn't offer clean answers about which path tends to follow which kind of pressure, and that uncertainty is worth carrying with you as the next several days unfold. There are a few specific things worth watching closely from here because they'll tell you far more than any official statement. Watch whether Iran begins visibly demonstrating increased activity at its secondary export terminals in ways that show up clearly on commercial satellite monitoring. If Tehran makes a public show of running Bandar-e or its smaller terminals at higher capacity, that's a strong signal the pivot and price strategy is already underway, and that the regime has chosen economic survival over immediate military escalation as its first real response. Watch whether China says anything official at all about disruption to its Iranian oil supply arrangements. Beijing's silence on this particular question will likely tell you more about the private conversations happening behind closed doors than any formal statement either government eventually issues. And watch the actual ship movement data through the Strait of Hormuz, not the political statements surrounding it, but the raw commercial tracking numbers maritime services publish daily. Those numbers will reveal whether Iran is already applying quiet pressure on commercial shipping as a form of counter-pressure, and that kind of pressure can show up in the data well before any official Iranian response is ever announced. Every one of those threads connects back to the same underlying question at the heart of this story. For 13 straight nights, Washington told Tehran exactly what was coming. For 13 straight nights, Iran's leadership weighed whether the warning was a bluff, whether moving assets was more dangerous than simply staying put, or whether ongoing diplomatic talks might still produce a solution before the military track produced an actual strike. Iran was wrong about at least one part of that calculation. But what this strike actually proves isn't that Iran has been defeated, and it isn't that this war is anywhere close to a conclusion. What it proves is that a threshold has been crossed, the threshold protecting civilian-adjacent economic infrastructure with direct global commodity market consequences. Previous restraint around that threshold existed because crossing it meant accepting economic fallout that becomes extremely difficult to contain once it starts spreading. That restraint no longer holds the way it once did. Every government in the region is now quietly recalculating what the United States is actually prepared to target once it decides the cost of holding back outweighs the cost of acting. And every government watching from outside the region, with no direct stake in this conflict but plenty of stake in global energy prices, is running that exact same calculation right now. An island doesn't need an army to defend it. It needs distance, and enough perceived consequence attached to closing that distance that nobody's willing to try. Kharg Island lost that distance after 13 nights of warnings that almost nobody outside a small circle was fully paying attention to. What Iran does next determines the true scale of what was actually lost here. Did it lose something recoverable, something patched together over the coming months while the war grinds on in familiar patterns? Or did it lose something that permanently changes the cost calculation of this entire war for everyone connected to it, and every capital watching from a safe distance? Those two futures start out looking almost identical. They rarely stay that way for long. Somewhere tonight, in a household far from any headline about this island, someone is quietly checking an oil price dashboard, trying to understand what those numbers mean for decisions they need to make before the week is out. They weren't planning for Kharg Island to be part of their equation. Almost nobody outside a very small circle was. That's simply what happens quietly, without fanfare, in every economy connected to this stretch of water. A decision made in a room thousands of miles away reshapes the numbers everyone else has to work with, whether they ever learn the name of the island responsible or not. Somewhere tonight, a crew aboard a tanker in the Persian Gulf is watching the water, calculating what the next few days look like for the route they're sailing. They didn't choose this war. They didn't make any of the decisions that led here. They're simply managing the consequences of choices made in capitals far from where they're standing, the way every crew on every ship connected to this conflict has been doing for months, mostly without recognition, mostly without their names ever appearing anywhere near a headline. That's the part of this story that rarely gets told with the weight it deserves. Not the strategy sessions, not the satellite images, not the market charts moving in real time, but the ordinary people on tankers, at refineries, at gas stations thousands of miles from the Persian Gulf, absorbing the consequences of a decision made in a war they never asked to be part of. This story isn't over yet, and the real answer to everything we've discussed today won't come from a press release or a political statement. The answer will come from what Iranian commanders actually choose to do on land and at sea in the coming days, not from the rhetoric surrounding it. That's the moment to watch, and when it comes, as always, we'll be here to explain it clearly. If this helped you understand what's really going on beneath the headlines, be sure to subscribe, because the next chapter of this story is probably taking shape somewhere on that same coastline right now, and you wouldn't want to learn about it from others. See you in the other videos. Stay healthy.